Equitable treatment, an impossible communist dream. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Ainslie Insights, brought to you by Ainslie Bullion, Ainslie Crypto, and the Gold and Silver Standard as the Ainslie Group celebrates 50 years. Today, welcome back Alex, who's been looking into some proposed policies out of the US that have left her scratching her head. How are you going today, Alex?
I'm going really well. How are you?
Good. I think scratching your head would be a fair statement. We were talking about this a little bit just before we came on camera, and it's boggling the mind a little bit, some of what's being proposed here. But start us off today talking about Kamala and the proposed policy. Really seems a little bit like Venezuela, and you point that out in the article. Did not end well there. Talk us through some of those similarities and what potentially is at play here.
All right. So I believe in Australia, like shopping supermarkets margins are actually quite high, and sort of 16% or something like that. But when you go overseas, I've always been told it's quite different over there, with most supermarkets making 1 to 3% on most goods. So, and then, producers in a competitive market, if someone's producing bread and it's a competitive market like the US, you don't have monopolies and duopolies like you have in Australia. There's a lot of people making bread. The margins, again, are slim. So in the US on food, we've had about 20% inflation since Biden came in, so over the last 4 years. And of that, supermarkets make 1.6%. There's no margin. And it's gone up 20%. Well, it's gone up 20% in the supermarkets, and they've made 1.6%. So Kamala is saying that inflation's too high on food, taking no accountability to the $11 trillion they've spent in the last 4 years. Just like every government around the world seems to just be blaming inflation on corporations or consumers. They're not looking at what they're doing. They're just blaming something else. So how is she going to tame inflation? She is going to put price controls in. So that's a fantastic thought when most of the things that she's trying to put price controls in have 1.6% margin. So those sorts of goods, because they're manufactured, they have high wage input. It basically means that wages can't go up, because if you price cap something, the wages won't be able to go up at 3% to keep up with inflation. So it's just this ridiculous scenario that is being tried time and time again. They've tried it in Argentina. In 2003, they brought it in Venezuela. And since in the last 10 years in Venezuela, they keep bringing in more and more price controls, and yet inflation has averaged 9,000% over the last 10 years. So it doesn't work.
Well, it's economics 101, really. Like you learn that very early in any economics degree or any economics course, that price controls distort the market. Like that, it's pretty logical. It's not a complex thing to understand. I mean, I would argue it's not even controversial, really, that it's a bad idea. It's pretty universally slammed as a bad idea. Is it just that the US hasn't really experienced that, so the collective memory has forgotten it's a bad idea? Why would you even put that forward?
Well, just like I was saying, every other government in the world seems to not want to blame this crazy spending on anything that is creating inflation. Michelle Bullock came out over the last 4 weeks and said, we're not dropping interest rates. And the government got up and said, oh, this is terrible. RBA is working against us, not dropping interest rates. But your spending is increasing at 6% per annum, and the economy is growing at 2%. You're the problem. She's not the problem. She's stuck between a rock and a hard place, and the poor thing, I'm sure she doesn't want to be putting, the bulk of the hardship onto people with mortgages. She's forced to do it. And the government comes out and, brandishes her and says, not doing the right job. What else can she do? And I mean, the US is exactly the same. You keep spending, inflation keeps going up. If you do not want to take responsibility for it, you just say something like, I'm going to price control. Yep. So I don't know. It seems to me that was the only logical thing that they've got left to blame.
Well, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. when you study history in any form, and just like I said, economics 101, I mean, situations like that create black markets. There's lots of issues that
black market, scarcity, poor quality of goods.
it all flows from that because they're forced into a situation. Absolutely.
Monopolies too. So
yes,
you just lose businesses. Like, it's just chaotic what ends up happening.
But you also pointed out there was another policy in there, this idea of capital gains on unrealized assets. Now, we've talked about this before as it's the easy solution. I can understand why politicians choose this one. They go, well, the capital gains are all sitting with the wealthy. Let's charge them tax on that, even if they haven't actually realized those gains yet. But similar to that, what we were just talking about with the consequences that flow right through the economy, there's massive consequences from this, aren't there?
I mean, if they had done this 30 years ago, before the stock market started to just rise at this rapid pace, in fact, let's go back to the 1950s, I think, when PE ratios were around 10, you could have probably started there. But then you started flooding economies with money. That money went into stock markets, and the wealth gap just grew and grew and grew. So to now retrospectively, fundamentally say, oh, we're going to tax the wealthy on unrealized capital gains, you're potentially going to crash the stock market. So so what actually happens for people, say, I use the example of Elon Musk because he's made a lot of his money in the last 10 years. This guy owns 20% of Tesla. He's done a fantastic job. If he needs money, he just borrows against the shares. Because if you borrow against the shares, you're not realizing the gain and you don't pay tax. Now, that is a system that they've allowed to happen over the last 80 years, making money for banks, and it reduces the tax that people pay on their wealth. So, but you cannot then turn around 80 years after the horse has bolted and say, okay, now we're going to tax unrealized profit, because if Elon Musk owns 20% of Tesla and he is going to be taxed 25% on his 20% gain, 25% of the 20%, he's going to be forced to sell 5% of his stock.
Yep.
And he won't be the only one in Tesla, but because you have to have $100 million in assets, but let's just pick him as one example. 5% of stock is sold off or to fund his tax liability. What do you think happens to Tesla stock? What do you think happens to mums and dads who've invested in Tesla? What happens to your retirement fund? You crash the stock. And, Tesla is one example. It's repeated across the whole stock market. You crash the stock market. And then your wealth is reduced everywhere else. Your tax is reduced everywhere else. And Elon Musk is sitting on a tax loss because he's overpaid on an unrealized tax. So why?
Well, and I can follow that example through even further to say it's not just Elon Musk in that scenario. It's effectively everyone. They're all trying to sell at the same time. Yeah. What does that do? Like, it's ill-conceived. It is ill-conceived.
But it is only high net wealth individuals, over $100 million. But I would argue that makes up a huge percent of the owners of stocks. So yes, you're right. It'll run through the stock market. You've got a lot of stocks that are highly concentrated to individuals. Amazon as well. It will run through the market.
And you can not think that's good that it's concentrated in the hands of individuals. Like, that's fine. You can disagree with it. But the point is that there will definitely be consequences if you implement a policy like that you haven't fully thought through. And as is always the case, it's not the ultra rich who are going to be the ones suffering because of the consequences of that.
Everyone.
That's right. It flows through to everyone.
And it is the possibility, like 80 years ago, when they weren't taxing capital gains and, the stock market started going crazy and people worked out that I borrow money against my shares rather, maybe 80 years ago, let's do an unrealized capital gains tax then, or let's not let banks loan against shares back then. But the horse has bolted. Like, you can't fix this.
Yeah, certainly turning back the clock never works in that scenario. To wrap it all up with the headline, equitable treatment versus equality, is that you mentioned the word communism. Yeah, it
I
doesn't
haven't yet.
seem when
We
we were
did it in
talking
our
about
side
it,
chat.
we talk about it. Is that where this is that the type of policy that this is, where you've got you can't really achieve equitable treatment, and you can't equate equitable treatment and equality. It seems to be the driver here that is the catchphrase, if you will, for what is driving these decisions. Talk to us about that.
Right. So Kamala's fundamental thing that she is trying to achieve, and I'm going to look this up because I think it is the most amazing statement I think I've ever heard. Equitable treatment means we all end up in the same place. All right. So I invest all my money, I risk everything, and my best friend, they're a dog bludger. They don't want to do anything. So we're going to lift them all the way to nearly the top of the cliff. In fact, we're going to have to throw them above where I end up because they're just going to lose money on the way back down anyway. So they start higher than I end up and lose money, and then we end up at the same place. I then go, you know what? I don't want to work. I don't want to risk my money. I don't want to do anything. Eventually, everyone comes back down. That is communism. Equality is what everyone has always sought to, have in a society, which I totally agree with. Everybody has the same base to get ahead. And we don't have equality now. So it's not fair, it's not just, it's not reasonable. But, it's getting better, and it has gotten better. Probably with all of the recent inflation, it's gone backwards again. So that's, a terrible thing. But equality is giving people opportunities in a democracy, in a capitalist society. If they work hard, you get ahead. Yep. Equitable treatment is just communism. Because if you're all going to end up in the same place, you might as well all end up in the same ditch because you're not going to reach the top of a mountain.
And I think it's fair to say from history, we know that system doesn't work. It's kind of the same point we're making earlier. We know price controls don't work because every time they've been implemented, they haven't worked. It's not rocket science here. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And I think that's what you're saying here as well.
It's kind of like that whole misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation is someone doesn't know the truth, so they say it, but they were misinformed. Disinformation is when they know the truth and spread a lie.
Yep.
It's hard to disseminate between those two words. I would say that equitable treatment and equality are those two words that you can't confuse them because they have very different intentions. So the fact that this is the intention, I find insane because it is the difference between democracy and communism.
As always, a fascinating and feisty discussion. So thank you for your work on that today, Alex. I think people will enjoy that conversation. I certainly do, looking at what's going on and really putting it through some of those historical filters. You do leave scratching your head.
Yeah, pretty much.
So thank you. Thank you, everyone, for watching. We'll chat again soon.